From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden continues with his roadshow touting Bidenomics as the latest jobs report shows slower hiring in June. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. Welcome and happy Friday to you both. President Biden has now embraced the term Bidenomics as a marketing slogan for his economic record. Here he is Thursday in West Columbia, South Carolina, where, according to local news reports, he was highlighting a manufacturing partnership between Enphase Energy and Flex Ltd., which will reportedly create about 600 jobs.
Bidenomics is just another way of saying restoring the American dream. 40 years of trickle-down limited the dream to those at the top. But I believe that every American willing to work hard should be able to get a good job no matter where they live.
Alicia, your column this week suggests a counter tour of some failures of Bidenomics. The headline, if listeners want to go find that, is What Biden's Invest in America Tour Leaves Out. And I'm wondering if you can give us a quick overview of some of those examples.
Yeah, sure. I would start with the Lordstown, the plant that was closed when Lordstown, the EV startup Motors, went bankrupt the other week because the proximate cause was a dispute with Foxconn, but it had basically been running on fumes for a while, trying to scale up its manufacturing. Most of its vehicles had to be recalled because they had problems. And, you know, what's interesting about Lordstown is it's actually not a particularly unique example. There's a lot of other electric vehicle manufacturers, Rivian, Lucid, Fisker, and even smaller ones like Canoo, who are also experiencing some troubles. Rivian stock popped this week on some good news, but it's still valued about 10% of what it was at its peak after it went public in this kind of green energy euphoria. But a lot of these electric vehicle manufacturers are actually struggling to execute on their ambitions, and they're running into problems. They're having to recall vehicles. They're laying off workers. And these issues aren't even unique to the EV startups. They're also plaguing a lot of the traditional manufacturers. For instance, Ford, Stellantis actually had closed a plant where it was producing its Jeep Cherokees for years, had to lay off more than 1,000 workers, and has announced buyouts for about 33,000, citing the high cost of its electrification. And this was a plant that in Illinois. So a lot of the jobs that are actually being created are actually just replacing some of those that have been lost. The United Auto Workers actually estimates that about 35,000 union jobs will be lost in the EV transition. And that's partly because the EVs just require fewer parts, and they're actually a lot more expensive. And as an executive has warned, is that the consumers cannot be forced to bear this price because they won't. EVs are already 20% more expensive, and they're just not going to buy the cars if the prices go up too much. These automakers are going to have to become very lean, and in many cases now almost entirely dependent on the government welfare. I mean, Ford got a $9.2 billion loan guarantee basically at the Treasury rate, which would probably save it a couple $1 billion. It's also relying on other kinds of tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act. These battery tax credits for building battery plants are extremely lucrative, and I think are estimated to cost just over the next decade about $150 billion. Just take another example of where a Republican challenger might consider stopping on his anti-Bidenomics tour, maybe the Keystone, Murdo, South Dakota, which was a stop on the Keystone pipeline route that would have actually was a substation for the oil pumps that Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, recall, on his first day in office. And the result is that, about 11,000 construction jobs will be destroyed. And now the left ironically says, well, those are just temporary construction jobs. Well, what do you think a lot of the jobs are on the renewables plants? Those actually employ very few workers on an operating basis, many fewer than in natural gas or nuclear plants, which is why you have a lot of the unions that represent nuclear and gas and coal plants are opposing the solar and wind just because these do not provide long-term jobs. And so a lot of the jobs that the Biden is going out there touting, actually, they're just really short-term jobs in terms of construction. And really, there's a lot of demand for construction right now for all kinds of projects. So these aren't really creating new jobs. They're probably just shifting jobs from where they otherwise would be creating more value.
Kim, do you have a sense of what the president means by the term Bidenomics, or is this a campaign slogan more than anything? I guess I would point to a White House fact sheet statement that is out late June called Bidenomics is Working. And there are many things in here, everything from promoting competition to making it easier for workers to join a union. But the top bullet point is making smart public investments in America. And to me, Kim, I guess that sounds like industrial policy, the government handing out cash to the businesses that it thinks are going to win the future.
Yeah, industrial policy. Another word for it is a lot of spending, government spending. And that's why you have the White House out there talking about Bidenomics. Remember, the first year it was in office, for the first 2 years it was in office, we had historic, unprecedented amounts of dollars being thrown into the economy by a Democratic Congress, signed by a president, whether it was the initial supposed COVID rescue plan, the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act. We also had the Inflation Reduction Act, which was an enormous handout to green energy. And they have to try to justify this because when most Americans look at it, they see the only real return that they've got from this blowout is a lot of inflation, higher interest rates, and increasingly growing layoffs as a result of some of this industrial policy. So you see the administration trying to cobble together some claim that there was a plan all along, rather than simply it having bended to progressive demands to throw money everywhere. But, I would point out just a few things that are problematic with this. I mean, one thing that they've been boasting about is manufacturing investment. They've been running around claiming that it has doubled over the past 2 years. And you see certain newspapers backing this up, talking about a factory boom. A lot of this, as Alicia was alluding to, is going into projects, the next generation of cylindras that aren't likely to pan out and aren't likely to create a lot of long-term jobs. And that is if they last at all. But the reality is that most of that increase in spending, if you look at that graph and the administration's own report on this question of manufacturing spending acknowledges this, is that those numbers are high because of inflation, because labor and materials costs have grown so much under this administration. If you deflate those numbers, if you take out for inflation, construction spending is kind of even, maybe even down a little bit from prior to the pandemic and the beginning of this administration. So it's industrial policy. Alicia gave a couple of wonderful examples of how that almost always goes wrong. And I think you have to ask about the value of it as well, too, because when you put money into things that are not necessarily a market creation, but rather a government creation, a government mandate, it doesn't usually pan out the way you want it to, and it's very expensive. Just recently, the energy economist Robert Bryce on his Substack noted that in the last 18 years, we have spent $4.1 trillion globally on wind and solar power. Okay. And to put that in perspective, that is more than the GDP of Germany, which is the fourth largest economy out there. Yet, despite that, hydrocarbon use has increased at 3.4 times the rate. And the amount of energy that is produced from solar and wind is only slightly more than it was 18 years ago. We're talking a couple of percentage points. So my point being is that government can direct all of this money at things, but it doesn't mean that it's going to pan out, and it doesn't mean it's a good investment. In fact, indeed, usually it's a very poor investment, and it also misdirects capital away from things where the money could do a lot more good.
And that's one of the reasons I think that government is particularly bad at this type of thing. I mean, venture capitalists pick their share of losers as well. But Kim, to the point that you were making, one of the issues with government is when they pick a loser, they often continue on doing that thing, even after it's clear there's not the market demand for it. Another thought is that the temptation to expand the rules and regulations is always there. And the CHIPS Act, Alicia, is maybe a great example of this. Remember, this was a public program that was passed by Congress in order to address a specific concern about computer chip manufacturing not being enough in the United States. And then the first thing that happened was the Commerce Secretary put all sorts of social policy goals on it that were not in the legislation as passed by Congress. Everything from things like mandating the type of child care that would need to be offered by the construction companies that were working on projects. In recent days, Alicia, the Commerce Department is also expanding the program beyond just the core of computer chip manufacturing and making this money available to suppliers, producers of chemicals and tooling and so forth. And I think that's another core problem with this kind of thing when it's done by the government is it is very difficult in the political context to keep it narrowly focused on the goal of making a certain company succeed, because the temptation is always to try to jam in whatever else the political party's agenda includes into this program.
Well, right. And I don't even know that the real goal here is to make a single company succeed. I think it's just really to throw a bunch of money out of projects in a real venture capital model and hope that maybe one or two succeed, in understanding that a lot of them will actually fail. And I think the Journal actually had a really good story last week on the Energy Department's basically loan office program that the Inflation Reduction Act funded to the tune of $400 billion. And so this office is just essentially throwing around money to whatever companies. I think it's gotten about applications for about $120 billion of loans. And the head of the office has said, well, we're planning to basically fund everything. Well, everything except those priorities or those projects that the Biden administration doesn't like. For instance, like carbon capture. And actually, interestingly, I thought Toyota came out this last week and said it was going to float an ESG bond to finance its electrification goals. And first thought that came to my mind was, well, is the administration refusing to fund Toyota because it isn't sufficiently committed to electrification, has raised some concerns about EVs, and therefore the Toyota has to go to the private market and raise capital and borrow at a slightly higher rates than, say, Ford, which has got that $9.2 billion sweetheart loan. And to your point about, well, subsidies beget subsidies. And I think we're seeing that, across the board in terms of it's not just the Inflation Reduction Act, it subsidizes electric vehicles. Well, then it has to subsidize the batteries, the creation of the batteries. Well, then it has to subsidize the cathode and the anode materials that go into them. But then also has to subsidize the refining and the mining, the extraction of the critical minerals that go into them. And so the Energy Department, again, is loaning all these businesses along the supply chain money to perform all these requirements to produce electric vehicles, because otherwise these companies wouldn't be able to do it. And actually, I'll just throw out another example with just renewable energy. You can subsidize solar and wind all you want, but then you need, transmission lines and to actually connect them to the grid. So the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the quote-unquote bipartisan infrastructure bill, include a lot of money to subsidize transmission lines. But one problem with actually transmission lines, not just the difficulty in permitting them, is, well, they actually require these big electric transformers to actually connect to the grid, but there's a shortage of transformers. So what now there's a big push from the utility industry for the government to subsidize the manufacturing of transformers, but that's not enough. And so now, because in order to produce transformers, you need this specialized kind of electrical steel. Oh, but we don't have enough electrical steel in this country. So now the electrical steel industry is asking for subsidies to produce that. Kind of reminds me of the joke about it's turtles all the way down. In this case, it's subsidies all the way down.